Try something for me. Stand up, wherever you are, and take 3 steps backward. Just 3. Slow. Now. Did you notice what happened? Not in your legs. Everybody notices the legs. I mean in your head. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where everything got louder, more present. Your eyes got sharper. Your ankles started reporting in like they suddenly remembered they had a job to do. You went from coasting to computing, and you did not decide to do it. Your brain did it for you. The question is, why? See, this is one of those beautiful problems in physics, where the answer seems like it should be obvious, and then the more you look at it, the more extraordinary it becomes. Walking backward is just walking forward with a minus sign, right? You reverse the velocity vector, change the direction. Everything else stays the same. Same muscles, same joints, same bones, same nervous system. Just a reversal of direction. Should be trivial. It is not trivial. It is one of the most dramatic computational shifts your brain can undergo during waking life, and it happens in less than a second. And the consequences ripple through every layer of your nervous system, from the cerebral cortex to the soles of your feet. And nobody told your brain to do any of it. It just did it. So let us figure out why. The first thing you need to understand is how walking forward actually works, because most people have never thought about it, and the answer is quite surprising. You might assume that you walk forward by deciding to walk forward. You think, I would like to go to the kitchen, and your brain plans the route, sends commands to the muscles, monitors the execution, and you end up at the refrigerator. Conscious decision, conscious control, conscious execution. That is almost completely wrong. Walking forward, the kind you do every day, the kind you have been doing since you were about a year old, is run almost entirely by structures below the level of conscious awareness. There is a set of nuclei deep in the brain called the basal ganglia, ancient structures, evolutionarily very old, and they handle the sequencing of habitual motor patterns. Once a motor sequence has been practiced enough times, the basal ganglia take it over. They run it automatically. They do not consult the cortex. They do not need to. The pattern is stored, the timing is calibrated, and the whole thing executes like a program that has been compiled and no longer needs the source code. Below the basal ganglia, there is the cerebellum. Beautiful structure. It sits at the base of your skull, behind the brainstem, and it weighs about 150 grams, roughly the size of your fist. But here is the thing about the cerebellum that always astonishes me. It contains more neurons than the entire rest of the brain. Estimates run from about 69 billion to 80 billion granule cells packed into that folded surface. More neurons in that one small organ than in the vast expanse of cerebral cortex that we associate with everything we call thinking. What does the cerebellum do? It predicts. It runs a continuous forward model of every movement you make. Before your foot hits the ground, the cerebellum has already predicted where the ground will be, how hard the impact will be, how much your knee will flex, how your weight will transfer. It compares the prediction with the actual sensory feedback, and if the prediction is accurate, the movement is smooth and no correction is needed. If the prediction is wrong, the cerebellum computes an error signal and adjusts the next step. This happens in milliseconds. You never feel it happening. And then, even deeper, at the level of the spinal cord, there are what we call central pattern generators. These are neural circuits right there in the spinal column that can produce the rhythmic alternation of your legs without any input from the brain at all. We know this from animal studies. You can disconnect the spinal cord from the brain in a cat, and the spinal cord will still produce walking-like patterns in the limbs. The rhythm is built into the cord itself. So when you walk forward, what is actually happening is this. The basal ganglia select and sequence the motor program. The central pattern generators in the spinal cord produce the basic rhythm. The cerebellum refines the timing and predicts the sensory consequences. And the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain you think of as you, the part that decides and deliberates and worries about what to have for dinner, that part is essentially offline. It is free to think about other things. There was a very nice study by Pedersen and colleagues at the University of Copenhagen, published in 2012, where they recorded electroencephalographic signals from the scalp during treadmill walking. They put electrodes directly over the leg motor area, the strip of cortex that controls leg movement, and they looked for corticomuscular coherence, which is a measure of how much the cortex is directly driving the muscles. What they found was that during steady forward walking, significant coherence appeared only in a very narrow window during the swing phase in the 24 to 40 Hz frequency band. The cortex gives a brief burst of input just before heel strike, and that is it. The rest of the stride cycle is handled below. Your brain has automated walking so completely that the cortex barely participates. This is efficient. This is elegant. This is exactly what a well-engineered system should do. Push the routine operations down to the lowest level that can handle them and free up the expensive hardware for novel problems. I used to think about this in terms of computer design. When you build a computer, you do not have the central processor handle every routine operation. You build dedicated hardware for the repetitive stuff, input-output controllers, graphics processors, memory management units, and you let the central processor focus on the novel computations that only it can do. The brain does the same thing. It has dedicated hardware for walking, the basal ganglia for sequencing, the pattern generators for rhythm, the cerebellum for prediction and error correction, and it reserves the cortex, the most expensive neural real estate in the system, for problems that actually require general-purpose computation. This is wonderful engineering, but it has a consequence that nobody thinks about until it matters. If the cortex is not engaged during forward walking, then forward walking does not exercise the cortex. If the cerebellum is not generating prediction errors during forward walking, then forward walking does not challenge the cerebellum. If the proprioceptive system is reporting the same signals in the same order it has reported for 50 years, then forward walking does not stimulate proprioceptive adaptation. The entire higher-order motor and cognitive system is left idle, and in the nervous system, idle means atrophying. Circuits that are not used get pruned. Connections that are not activated weaken. White matter tracts that carry no traffic thin out. Forward walking keeps the cardiovascular system healthy, while the neural control systems that manage balance, spatial awareness, and motor learning quietly degrade from disuse. Nobody mentions this. Nobody prescribes against it. But it is happening in every person who walks the same routes at the same speed on the same surfaces day after day, year after year. Now reverse the direction and watch the whole architecture come apart. I want you to think about what changes, physically, when you reverse a step. In forward walking, the heel contacts the ground first. The knee flexes under load as your weight transfers onto the leading foot. The quadriceps muscles, the big muscles on the front of your thigh, contract eccentrically, meaning they lengthen while generating force. They are acting as shock absorbers. They slow your descent as gravity pulls your weight onto the forward foot. The hip flexors swing the trailing leg forward, and the whole cycle repeats. Heel, flex, absorb, swing. Heel, flex, absorb, swing. 200 million repetitions over a lifetime, give or take. Now reverse it. In backward walking, the toe contacts the ground first, not the heel, the toes. Immediately, the entire temporal sequence of joint angles is inverted. The knee extends during early stance instead of flexing. The quadriceps switch from eccentric contraction, which is lengthening under load, to concentric contraction, which is shortening under load. Instead of absorbing impact, they are actively pushing the body backward. This changes the mechanical loading on the joint itself. There was a study published in the Journal of Biomechanics that measured patellofemoral compression forces, the forces pressing the kneecap against the groove in the thigh bone during forward and backward running at the same speed. Forward running produced peak forces of 4.5 times body weight. Backward running dropped that to 3.5 times body weight, which is about a 24% reduction. And over 93% of that difference was explained by the reduced knee extensor moment during the reversed gait. So the forces on the joint go down, but the muscular effort goes up. The muscles work harder while the joint is loaded less. That is an interesting trade-off, and it matters clinically, but it is not the part I find most interesting. The part I find most interesting is what happens to the signals. See, every joint in your body is wired with sensors. In the muscles, you have muscle spindles, tiny stretch receptors embedded in the muscle fibers that detect changes in length. If the muscle is stretching, the spindle fires. If the muscle is contracting, the spindle quiets. In the tendons, you have Golgi tendon organs, which detect changes in tension. And in the soles of your feet, you have mechanoreceptors, pressure sensors that map the distribution of force against the ground with every step. During forward walking, these sensors fire in a pattern that your brain has cataloged over your entire life. Heel pressure first, then midfoot, then toe push-off. Quadriceps lengthening, then stabilizing, then the hip flexors pulling the leg through. Every signal arrives in the expected order, at the expected time, with the expected magnitude. The cerebellum's forward model matches the incoming data. No errors. No corrections needed. Reverse the motion, and every signal arrives in the wrong order. The pressure starts at the toes, not the heel. The quadriceps shorten when they are expected to lengthen. The muscle spindles fire in the reverse temporal sequence. The Golgi tendon organs report a tension profile that has no match in the stored library. Every proprioceptive signal, and proprioception is just the word for the sense of where your body is in space, every one of these signals comes in backward, like playing a recording in reverse. Now here is where it gets really interesting, because it is not just the proprioception. There is the vestibular system. In your inner ear, you have 3 semicircular canals, tiny fluid-filled tubes oriented in 3 orthogonal planes, like the 3 axes of a coordinate system. When your head rotates, the fluid, called endolymph, lags behind due to inertia, and hair cells in the canals detect the lag and report the angular acceleration to the brainstem. You also have the otolith organs, the utricle and the saccule, which are chambers lined with hair cells embedded in a layer of calcium carbonate crystals. These detect linear acceleration and the pull of gravity. Together, the semicircular canals and the otolith organs tell your brain which way your head is moving and which way is down. During forward walking, the vestibular system reports a consistent pattern. The head bobs in a predictable rhythm. The linear acceleration vector points forward and down. The relationship between head position and gravitational pull follows the same trajectory stride after stride. But when you reverse direction, the linear acceleration vector reverses. The relationship between head motion and visual flow inverts. And the vestibular signals, combined with the reversed proprioceptive stream and the reversed optic flow from the visual system, create what I would call a multisensory integration crisis. The brain receives 3 channels of information about body position and movement: vision, proprioception, and vestibular input. And under normal forward walking conditions, it assigns a stable weighting to each channel. Vision contributes about 1/3, proprioception about 1/3, the vestibular system provides the reference signal. These weights are fixed, because the brain trusts all 3 channels equally during familiar movement. Walk backward, and the weights destabilize. The visual flow moves in the unexpected direction relative to body motion. The proprioceptive sequence is temporally reversed. The vestibular system, which reports raw physics regardless of familiarity, becomes the only reliable anchor. So the brain has to recalculate in real time with every step how much to trust each channel. It has to solve a problem it has not solved in decades, possibly ever, and it has to solve it at the speed of locomotion, which means milliseconds per correction. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you are navigating a ship using 3 instruments: a compass, a radar, and a star chart. Under normal conditions, all 3 agree, and you trust them equally. Now suppose you sail into a magnetic storm. The compass starts giving you reversed readings. The radar still works. The star chart still works. But the compass is now lying to you. You have to very quickly figure out which instruments to trust and which to discount. And you have to do it while still sailing the ship, because stopping is not an option. That is what the brain does when you walk backward. One of its primary navigation instruments, proprioception, starts reporting in a language the brain has not heard before. Vision is providing flow patterns that conflict with the proprioceptive data. Only the vestibular system is reporting clean physics. And the brain, which has to keep you upright and moving, has to recompute its trust allocation across all three channels at the speed of each footfall. This is an extremely demanding computation. Neuroscientists call it sensory reweighting. I call it the brain's emergency calibration protocol. There was a study published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience that demonstrated exactly how powerful this calibration can be. They put older adults through structured balance challenges and measured the effect on postural control. What they found was that the training reduced overactive proprioceptive feedback, a compensatory mechanism that develops with age, and restored vestibular orientation. And when they estimated the magnitude of the improvement, they calculated it was equivalent to reversing approximately 10 years of age-related balance decline. 10 years. Not by making someone younger, by giving their nervous system a problem it had forgotten how to solve, and making it solve it again. That wobble you felt when you took those 3 steps backward, that was not clumsiness. That was your central nervous system running a full sensory recalibration in real time. That is an extraordinary piece of computation, and your brain did it without being asked. Now, what does this recalibration look like from the inside? What is actually changing in the brain? This is where the electroencephalographic data gets interesting in a very specific way. There is a rhythm the brain produces called the mu rhythm, an oscillation in the 8 to 12 Hz frequency band that you can pick up with electrodes over the sensorimotor cortex. When sensorimotor neurons are idling, just sitting there with nothing to do, they tend to oscillate in synchrony, and that produces the mu rhythm. When those neurons are recruited for active processing, the synchrony breaks apart and the rhythm is suppressed. More suppression means more neurons pulled out of idle and into active service. A study published in Sensors in 2020 split the mu rhythm into 2 subbands. The lower band, mu1, runs from 8 to 10 Hz. The upper band, mu2, runs from 10 to 12 Hz. They measured both during forward and backward walking, and here is what they found. In the lower band, there was no significant difference. Forward walking and backward walking produced about the same amount of mu1 suppression, but in the upper band, the 10 to 12 Hz range, backward walking produced significantly larger suppression than forward walking. Not a little more, significantly more. Now, the upper mu band is specifically associated with active motor planning and sensorimotor integration. It is not the band that handles passive monitoring. It is the band that turns on when the cortex is actively computing a motor solution. Backward walking forces the motor cortex into a level of active engagement that forward walking simply does not require. There is more. A separate study on stroke patients, where researchers measured brain activity during 5 minutes of forward and backward walking, found that backward walking produced a significant increase in alpha band activity, specifically within the frontal cortex and the right parietal cortex. The frontal cortex, that is your executive planning center. The right parietal cortex, that is where spatial awareness and body position get integrated. Neither region showed significant changes during forward walking at the same speed. What this means is that when you reverse direction, the brain does not just increase the workload on the motor cortex. It recruits entirely different regions. Regions that handle planning. Regions that handle spatial reasoning. Regions that you would normally associate with solving problems, not with walking. And I think this is one of the most important points. This is not something you decide to do. You do not say, I think I will activate my prefrontal cortex now. The activation is involuntary. It is forced by the physics of the task. The brain has no choice but to bring its higher processing resources online. because the subcortical automation that handles forward walking cannot handle backward walking. The task demands have exceeded the capacity of the automatic system, and the cortex must step in. The brain is being tricked into working harder by the body, and it does not even know it is being tricked. Now let me take this one level deeper. What happens to the cerebellum when the prediction errors pile up? Remember, the cerebellum predicts. Every forward step you take, the cerebellum generates a prediction of the sensory consequences, compares that prediction with the actual input, and if there is a mismatch, it computes an error signal and sends corrections upward through a structure called the superior cerebellar peduncle. That peduncle is essentially a cable, a bundle of white matter tracts that connects the cerebellum to the thalamus and from there to the motor cortex. It is the communication highway through which cerebellar corrections reach the rest of the brain. During forward walking, this system hums along with almost no errors. 200 million repetitions have made the predictions nearly perfect. The error signals are tiny. The corrections are minimal. The peduncle carries a trickle of traffic. Reverse the direction, and the error signals explode. Every proprioceptive signal arrives in the wrong order. Every prediction fails. The cerebellum is suddenly computing enormous error corrections, step after step, and sending them upward through that peduncle at a rate it has not handled in years. Nora Fritz at Wayne State University published a study in the January 2026 issue of the Journal of Neurologic Physical Therapy that looked at exactly this. Fritz and her team put individuals with multiple sclerosis through an 8-week backward walking program combining treadmill and overground training. They did diffusion tensor imaging of the brain before and after the intervention, which is a way of measuring the structural integrity of white matter tracts. And they looked at 3 specific regions: the body of the corpus callosum, which is the bridge connecting the 2 hemispheres of the brain; the superior cerebellar peduncle, the cable I just described; and the corticospinal tract, the highway carrying motor commands from the cortex down to the spinal cord. After 8 weeks of backward walking, they found measurable structural changes in all 3 white matter tracts. Now let me be careful here. This was a small study, a case series, and it was conducted in a population with a specific neurological condition. Larger trials in healthy populations are needed before we can generalize. But the finding that the cerebellar peduncle, the specific tract that carries prediction error corrections from the cerebellum to the cortex, showed structural remodeling after backward walking training. That is anatomically exactly what you would predict from the mechanism. The cerebellum, flooded with prediction errors it has never had to handle at this rate, strengthens the wiring it needs to transmit those corrections. Use a cable more, the cable gets thicker. It is the same principle as muscles. Demand drives adaptation. And the cerebellum is not the only structure adapting. The errors cascade through the entire system. The cerebellar corrections reach the motor cortex, which must now incorporate novel correction signals into its motor plans. The motor cortex adjustments propagate down through the corticospinal tract to the spinal cord, where the pattern generators must modify their rhythms. And the sensory cortex, receiving all this reversed proprioceptive and vestibular input, must remap the relationship between sensory signals and body position. One reversal of direction, one change from plus to minus, and the entire chain from cortex to spinal cord is forced into a state of active recalibration. But here is the part that really surprises me: the cognitive effects. You would expect motor changes. You reversed a motor task, so motor circuits adapt. Fine. But why should walking backward affect thinking? Why should reversing the direction of locomotion have anything to do with memory, or attention, or problem solving? Aleksandar Aksentievich at the University of Roehampton, along with Brandt, Chakanikos, and Thorpe, published a study in the journal Cognition in 2018 that demonstrated something I find genuinely striking. They had 114 participants watch a video of a staged crime, a woman having her bag stolen. Then they split the participants into groups. One group walked forward 10 meters. One group walked backward 10 meters. A control group stood still, and they all answered 20 questions about what they had seen. The backward walking group got an average of 2 more answers correct than either the forward walking group or the standing group. 2 more answers from walking backward 10 meters. That is a statistically significant improvement in eyewitness recall from about 30 seconds of reversed locomotion. Oksentijevich did not stop there. He ran 5 more variations. He tested word recall, picture recall, imagined backward walking where the participants sat still and just imagined moving backward, and even simulated backward motion using video filmed from the back of a moving train. In every condition, every single one, backward motion improved memory performance, even imagined backward motion. They called it the mnemonic time travel effect. The idea is that there is a deep cognitive link between moving backward in space and moving backward in time. We say the past is behind us. The future is ahead. These are not just metaphors. They appear to be wired into the neural substrate of temporal cognition. Walking backward activates the mental circuitry associated with looking backward in time, which primes the memory retrieval system. Now, I find this absolutely wonderful as a piece of science, because it tells us something about the relationship between the body and the mind that we normally ignore. We think of cognition as something that happens in the brain, in some abstract computational space, disconnected from the physical orientation of the body. But this result says no. The direction your body moves through space influences the direction your mind moves through time. The body is not separate from the mind. The body is part of the computational machinery of the mind. Which way you are walking literally changes which memories are accessible. This should not be surprising, actually, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. For most of human history, moving backward meant retreating, retracing, going back the way you came. And when you go back the way you came, what do you need? You need your memory. You need to recall the terrain you already passed through, the landmarks you already noted, the decisions you already made. An organism that retrieves memories more efficiently when moving backward has a survival advantage. It can retrace its path more accurately. It can find the food source it visited yesterday. It can return to safety. So the mnemonic time travel effect is not some curious laboratory artifact. It may be the remnant of an ancient navigational adaptation, a coupling between locomotion direction and memory retrieval that was selected for over hundreds of thousands of years and that persists in our nervous system today, quietly waiting to be activated by the simple act of reversing direction. Daniel Schachter at Harvard, who is one of the foremost memory researchers in the world, commented on these findings and suggested that backward motion could be incorporated into cognitive interview techniques already used by law enforcement to improve eyewitness recall. That is not a trivial endorsement. Schachter does not say things like that casually. Now, the mnemonic time travel effect is one mechanism, and it is a cognitive one, operating through the metaphorical association between spatial direction and temporal direction. But there is a second mechanism operating simultaneously, and this one is purely physiological. A group at Dayananda Sagar University in India published a 2025 study on 36 adults aged 65 to 75. These were people at the age where cognitive decline is a real concern. The researchers put them through 6 weeks of backward walking training, 3 times per week, 30 minutes per session. They used 4-minute sets of backward walking with 5-minute rest intervals. Nothing extreme, nothing requiring special equipment. And they measured cognitive function using the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is a standardized screening tool that evaluates memory, attention, language, and executive functions on a scale from 0 to 30. Before the training, the group averaged a score of 25. Now, 25 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment is a threshold. A score of 25 suggests that further assessment may be warranted. It can indicate mild cognitive impairment. It is the score where a doctor starts paying attention. After 6 weeks of backward walking, the average score rose to 27.7. That is a gain of nearly 3 points on a 30-point scale, from a score that raises concern to a score considered normal, from the threshold of impairment to the range of health, in 6 weeks, from walking backward. And they also measured something called kinesiophobia using the Tampa scale, which quantifies the fear of movement. The score dropped from 50.6 to 27.6. These people were not only thinking more clearly, they had lost their fear of moving. They had regained confidence in their own bodies. How do we connect the motor changes to the cognitive changes? What is the physical link? I think the answer runs through a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which the researchers abbreviate as BDNF. This is a molecule the brain uses as a growth signal. BDNF promotes synaptic plasticity, the ability of synapses to strengthen or weaken in response to activity. It supports the survival of existing neurons. It stimulates the growth and differentiation of new ones. Physical exercise triggers the release of a ketone body called beta-hydroxybutyrate. This ketone crosses the blood-brain barrier and activates specific promoter regions on the BDNF gene, particularly promoter 1, which is activity-dependent. Slyman and colleagues at the Salk Institute demonstrated this mechanism and published it in the journal eLife in 2016. Exercise does not just make you feel better. It literally changes gene expression in the brain. It turns on the growth signal. Physical exercise has been shown to increase BDNF synthesis in the human brain by as much as 3-fold, 3 times the baseline level. Not a modest increase, a tripling. Now, all exercise does this, including forward walking. But backward walking adds something that forward walking does not. It adds cognitive demand. Forward walking is automatic. The cortex is offline. The prefrontal regions are free to wander. Backward walking forces the prefrontal cortex, the motor cortex, the parietal cortex, and the cerebellar thalamocortical loop into active engagement. The BDNF released by the physical exertion arrives in a brain that is already activated, already computing, already demanding synaptic resources. The growth signal arrives precisely where and when the demand for growth is highest. It is like the difference between sending building materials to an empty lot and sending building materials to a construction site where the workers are already on the job. Same materials, very different outcome. Think about it this way. If you go for a gentle forward walk, your body releases BDNF. Good. But the BDNF arrives in a brain where the cortex is daydreaming, the cerebellum is coasting, and the prefrontal regions are processing whatever you happen to be worrying about. The growth signal is there, but the demand for growth is low. The construction workers are on a coffee break. Now walk backward. Your body releases BDNF, same as before, because the physical exertion triggers the same beta-hydroxybutyrate pathway. But now the BDNF arrives in a brain where the motor cortex is firing at unprecedented rates, the cerebellum is computing more error corrections per second than it has in years, the prefrontal cortex is managing spatial planning and inhibitory control, and the proprioceptive processing centers are remapping signal sequences they have never encountered in this order. Every region that uses BDNF for synaptic strengthening is simultaneously demanding synaptic strengthening. The growth signal arrives at a construction site where every worker is already building as fast as they can and screaming for more materials. The principle is not complicated. It is just rarely exploited. Most exercise programs target either physical exertion or cognitive challenge, but not both simultaneously. And most cognitive training programs target mental effort without any physical exertion at all. Backward walking is one of the few activities that produces both at the same time, not because it was designed to, but because the biomechanics of reverse locomotion force the brain into a state of active computation that forward locomotion does not require. The dual stimulus is an emergent property of the physics, not a design feature of the exercise. And that makes it free. Now, I should be honest with you about what we know and what we do not know, because that matters. The motor cortex shift is well established. Multiple studies using electroencephalographic recording have confirmed that backward walking produces significantly greater cortical activation than forward walking. The mu rhythm data is clean, the effect is robust, and the interpretation is straightforward. I consider this solid. The cerebellar prediction error mechanism is physiologically logical and supported by Fritz's imaging data showing white matter changes in the cerebellar peduncle. But that study was small, and it was conducted in a population with multiple sclerosis, not in healthy adults. The anatomical reasoning is sound. The physics predicts exactly what was observed, but we need replication in larger samples and in neurologically typical populations before we call this established. The proprioceptive reversal is biomechanics. It is physics. The reduced joint forces, the switch from eccentric to concentric quadriceps activation, the reversed temporal sequence of sensory signals, these are measured facts. No ambiguity. The cognitive effects sit in a middle tier. Oksentijevich replicated the mnemonic time travel effect across 6 experimental conditions within the same study, which is encouraging. The Dayananda Sagar Mocha improvement is significant, but the study used a quasi-experimental design without a control group performing an equivalent amount of forward walking. We cannot fully separate the backward walking effect from the general effects of exercise, social engagement, or reduced anxiety about movement. The BDNF connection is the most speculative link. Exercise raises BDNF. Backward walking is exercise. Therefore, backward walking raises BDNF. That logic is valid, but no one has directly compared BDNF levels after backward versus forward walking at matched intensity. We do not know whether the additional cognitive demand of backward walking produces a greater neurotrophic response. The hypothesis is physiologically plausible. It is not confirmed. What I can tell you is that every study measuring a functional outcome of backward walking, motor, cognitive, or structural, has reported improvement. The direction of the effect is unanimous. The magnitude varies. The mechanisms are partially understood. But nobody has done the study and found that backward walking makes things worse, or does nothing. That consistency across diverse outcomes and diverse populations is, to my mind, meaningful. Now let me tell you what bothers me. What really bothers me about all of this. If you go to a vestibular rehabilitation clinic and you have a balance problem, they will put you through a very carefully structured program. Gaze stabilization exercises, where you track a target while moving your head. Habituation protocols, where they expose you to the stimuli that trigger your dizziness until your brain recalibrates. Balance training on unstable surfaces, where the ground shifts and your nervous system has to figure out how to stay upright. What is the mechanism underlying all of this? Sensory reweighting. The brain is forced to solve a novel balance problem by recalibrating how much it trusts each sensory channel, vision, proprioception, vestibular input. The therapist creates a controlled sensory conflict, and the brain resolves the conflict by updating its internal models. This is the same mechanism activated by walking backward. The clinical version costs between $100 and $250 per session. A typical course runs 1 to 2 sessions per week for 6 to 8 weeks. Total cost, $1,200 to $4,000, not including the diagnostic evaluation, which can involve video nystagmography, rotary chair testing, or computerized dynamic posturography. There is also a pharmaceutical angle. Donepezil, sold as Aricept, is the most widely prescribed cholinesterase inhibitor for cognitive decline. One of its documented effects, beyond its primary mechanism of preserving acetylcholine, is that it increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels in the central nervous system. It costs roughly $300 to $600 per month, and it is prescribed indefinitely. Exercise, particularly novel motor exercise that demands cognitive engagement, activates the same BDNF pathway through a different mechanism. The beta-hydroxybutyrate released during exertion crosses the blood-brain barrier and acts on the same gene promoters that pharmaceutical histone deacetylase inhibitors target in laboratory settings. The pathway converges on the same protein, the same synaptic plasticity, the same neuroprotective outcome. Now, I am not telling you to throw away your prescriptions. I want to be very clear about that. The pharmaceutical version exists because the body's own mechanism is not always sufficient, particularly in advanced neurodegeneration. A drug delivers a precise, consistent, controlled dose. Walking backward delivers a variable stimulus that depends on effort, duration, and individual fitness. They are not equivalent. The drug is necessary when it is necessary. But for the person whose cognition has begun to soften at the edges, whose balance has started to feel uncertain, whose Montreal cognitive assessment hovers around 25, the molecular pathway activated by 5 minutes of backward walking overlaps substantially with the pathways targeted by interventions that cost thousands of dollars a year. The sensory reweighting, the neurotrophic signaling, the cortical recruitment, all of it is available in a hallway. No equipment, no appointment, no insurance authorization. And there was a lovely study published in Geroscience in 2026 from Kyushu University in Japan. They tested 90 community-dwelling older adults and found that backward walking speed, just how fast you can walk backward, was a reliable predictor of balance capacity and fall risk. It correlated strongly with established clinical assessments, including the timed up-and-go test and balance confidence scores. The speed at which you walk backward tells you how well your nervous system integrates sensory information for postural control. The test and the treatment are the same act. Walking backward both reveals the state of the system and improves it. That kind of efficiency is rare in medicine. That kind of efficiency is what a physicist likes to see. There was a study, I should mention this, in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience on balance training in the elderly. They put older adults through structured balance challenges and measured the effect on their postural control systems. What they found was that the training reduced overactive proprioceptive feedback, which is a compensatory mechanism that develops with age, and restored vestibular orientation. And when they calculated the magnitude of the effect, they estimated it was equivalent to reversing approximately 10 years of age-related balance decline. 10 years. Not by turning back the clock. By giving the nervous system a problem it had not solved in a long time and forcing it to solve it again. This is what I love about the nervous system. It does not just degrade passively. It degrades in response to the absence of demand. Remove the demand, the system atrophies. Restore the demand, the system rebuilds. This is not unique to the nervous system, it is a general principle of biology, but the nervous system demonstrates it with particular elegance because the rebuilding is structural. The white matter tracks change. The synaptic weights change. The cortical maps change. The system literally reorganizes its hardware in response to the software demands you place on it. Forward walking, the kind we do every day, places almost no demand on the higher-order motor and cognitive systems that degrade fastest with age. The basal ganglia handle it. The spinal pattern generators handle it. The cerebellum coasts on its 200 million step prediction model. The cortex daydreams. And slowly, year by year, the circuits that are not being used get pruned. The connections that are not being activated weaken. The white matter tracks that are not carrying traffic thin. Reverse the direction, and you reverse the pruning, not metaphorically, structurally. You send traffic through tracts that have been idle. You generate prediction errors in a cerebellum that has been coasting. You activate a cortex that has been wandering. You fire proprioceptive patterns that have not been produced in years. And the system responds the way biological systems always respond to demand. It adapts. It strengthens. It rebuilds. 5 minutes. A hallway. That is the intervention. You know, there is a phrase people used to say, older people, your grandmother, your mother, the family doctor from 40 years ago. They did not know anything about mu rhythm suppression or cerebellar prediction error or beta-hydroxybutyrate-mediated gene transcription. They just said, walk it off. You are stuck, walk it off. You cannot remember something, walk it off. You feel dizzy, you feel unsteady, you feel old, walk it off. Not forward, not in any particular direction. Just move. Break the pattern. Do something your body was not doing a minute ago. And the old family doctor, the one who retired before anyone had heard of BDNF or diffusion tensor imaging, he had his own version. Use it or lose it. He meant the muscles. He meant the joints. He meant the heart. He did not know he was also describing the cerebellar thalamocortical loop, the proprioceptive signaling chain, the sensory reweighting mechanism, and the neurotrophic gene activation cascade. He did not need to know. The principle was correct. The mechanism was hidden, but the principle was always correct. That is the thing about folk wisdom. It is not folk nonsense. It is compressed observation accumulated over generations by people who were paying attention to what worked. They did not have the instruments to see why it worked. They just saw that it did. And now, 2,000 years into the project of Western science, we finally have the instruments, and what do we find? We find that walking it off is a multisystem neurological intervention that activates cortical recruitment, cerebellar recalibration, proprioceptive remapping, vestibular reweighting, prefrontal engagement, and neurotrophic signaling simultaneously. We find that the cost of the intervention is zero. We find that the equipment required is a flat surface. We find that the side effects are improved balance, improved cognition, reduced joint loading, reduced fear of movement, and structural remodeling of white matter tracts. Your grandmother did not publish this in the Journal of Neurologic Physical Therapy. But she was not wrong. I want to leave you with a picture. There is a person, 72 years old, living alone, who wakes up every morning and walks the same path from the bedroom to the kitchen that they have walked for 15 years. Same route to the mailbox. Same roads to the grocery store. The basal ganglia run the entire day. The cerebellum has not received a novel prediction error in months. The motor cortex is dormant. The prefrontal cortex, with no physical challenge to anchor it, drifts into rumination and worry. This person has been told to stay active. Good advice. But forward walking at a comfortable pace on flat ground, while it benefits the cardiovascular system, provides almost zero novel input to the motor control systems that degrade most rapidly with aging. The system that needs the most stimulation is getting the least. Now imagine this person turns around in their hallway and walks backward to the kitchen. 5 minutes, not fast, not dangerous, just backward. In those 5 minutes, the motor cortex activates. The cerebellum floods with prediction errors and begins recalibrating. The proprioceptive system fires in patterns it has not used in decades. The vestibular system recalculates its sensory weights. The prefrontal cortex is recruited. BDNF synthesis increases. The white matter tracts that connect all of these systems begin carrying traffic again. Same hallway, same person, same legs, just a reversal of direction. And the entire nervous system wakes up. That is what I find beautiful about this. Not that backward walking is some miracle cure. It is not. But that the nervous system is so exquisitely responsive to demand that a trivial change in the physics of locomotion, just a minus sign on the velocity vector, cascades through every level of neural organization and produces measurable structural, functional, and cognitive improvements. The system was never broken. It was understimulated. And the stimulus required to reactivate it was not a drug, or a device, or a clinical protocol costing $4,000. It was a direction change. Nature, as always, turns out to be more elegantly engineered than we assumed. And the more precisely we look, the more we see that the old advice was not folklore. It was physics. And you know what strikes me most about this whole thing? It is the asymmetry. We spend enormous effort and enormous money-building interventions that target one system at a time, a drug for cognition, a therapy for balance, a training program for motor control. Each intervention addresses one layer. Each specialist sees one layer. And each bill reflects one layer. But the body is not built in layers. The body is built as one system. The cerebellum that handles motor prediction is the same cerebellum that influences cognitive timing. The proprioceptive system that reports body position to the motor cortex also sends signals to the parietal cortex for spatial reasoning. The BDNF that strengthens synapses in the motor cortex also strengthens synapses in the hippocampus. The system is unified. The interventions are fragmented. And walking backward, by some accident of biomechanical simplicity, activates the unified system as a unified system. It does not know about the disciplinary boundaries we have erected between neurology and physical therapy and cognitive science and pharmacology. It just reverses direction and lets the physics propagate through every connected circuit simultaneously. I think there is a lesson in that. Not just about walking, about how we think about intervention in biological systems generally. The most powerful interventions may not be the most targeted ones. They may be the ones that respect the connectedness of the system and provide a stimulus that the system can distribute according to its own architecture. The body knows where the signal is needed. The body knows which circuits are understimulated. All it needs is the right input, and the distribution takes care of itself. A direction change, a minus sign on the velocity vector, that is the input, and the body does the rest. Now, I would like to hear from you. Next time you take those steps backward, what do you notice first? The wobble in your ankles or the sharpness behind your eyes? Tell me what you feel.